Welcome to This Explainer. For millennia, the grand pyramids of Egypt have towered over the desert sands, casting these incredibly long shadows over a civilization that has just absolutely fascinated humanity for generations. But to truly understand ancient Egypt, we really have to look past all that stone and look directly toward the water. Today, we're going to explore how a single geographic feature didn't just support a society, but literally engineered its economy, its technology, and its most monumental achievements. Okay, let's dive into this. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus famously observed that Egypt is the gift of the Nile. And honestly, he hit the nail on the head. The Nile isn't just some pretty backdrop to the Egyptian story. It is the ultimate geographic protagonist. Without it, the civilization as we know it simply would not exist. Period. It was the lifeline that divided their territory, provided this incredibly favorable environment, and served as the absolute foundation for their entire rise to power. So that brings us to a massive question, right? How did the predictable flooding of a single river actually build the most iconic monuments in human history? We so often view ancient Egypt as this static, immovable society of pharaohs and stone. But today, I want to totally shift your perspective. I want us to look at this civilization as a highly dynamic engine, one that was entirely driven by geographic cause and effect. All right, Section 1, the gift of the river, a civilization born from mud. Think about it from a macro perspective. The Nile acted as this massive, unstoppable ecological engine. Every single year, without fail, the summer floods would arrive. And when those floodwaters finally receded, they left behind this incredibly rich, fertile mud and silt all across the valley. That very mud became the literal foundation for their entire agricultural economy. The source material points out something fascinating. The first Egyptian farmers were actually hunter-gatherers, but the predictable arrival of this fertile soil allowed them to settle down, transition into farming communities, and plant things like wheat, lentils, and barley. The whole society was essentially born right out of this nutrient-rich mud. And it's honestly mind-blowing when you realize this wasn't just some flat, featureless plain. The Nile Valley actually featured a convex terrain that naturally encouraged the development of basins. In fact, archaeologists have discovered exactly 130 of these natural convex basins. They served as massive, ancient irrigation reservoirs. Every single year, the floodwaters would fill them up, trapping the water in the silt, naturally fertilizing the soil, and creating this absolutely perfect, ready-made agricultural system. Moving on to Section 2, harnessing the floodwaters, engineering at the human scale. So we've looked at the massive landscape, but now let's zoom way into the micro level. Let's see how a single farmer actually manipulated this immense water source. Now, what's really interesting about this invention is the sheer ingenuity of early human engineering. This is the Shadoof. While those 130 basins were out there trapping water on a macro scale, the individual farmers still needed a way to move that water to their specific crops. The Shadoof was a brilliant, hand-operated device that solved a massive logistical problem: fighting gravity. Let's walk through how this actually worked on a daily basis. Picture a farmer using a long pole with a bucket hung on a rope from one end. They lower that bucket right down into the river or canal. Then, using a heavy weight attached to the opposite end as a counterbalance, they could easily lift the heavy water back up. Finally, they just pivot and empty it into jugs for transport or pour it directly into their small irrigation ditches. This simple yet incredibly effective piece of technology kept vital crops like emmer wheat, which, by the way, they used for both bread and beer, alive and thriving under the blazing Egyptian sun. Let's jump to Section 3, Nilometers and the tax calculators, measuring water to measure wealth. Okay, let's zoom back out to the state level and see how the centralized government managed to monetize this massive agricultural engine. As these irrigation systems advanced with all sorts of canals and dams, the Egyptian government realized they desperately needed a way to track the water levels. Remember, in this world, water equals food, and food equals wealth. So they invented the Nilometer. Think about how incredible this is for a second. It wasn't just some cool scientific instrument. It was an ancient economic barometer that the state completely relied on to predict the prosperity of the entire upcoming year. And this brilliantly illustrates the direct, tangible link between nature and the state. The Egyptians used these Nilometers to precisely gauge the height of the floodwaters. Why? Because that exact height allowed the government to determine the specific tax levels the populace was supposed to pay that year. A perfect flood meant a huge harvest, which meant higher taxes. A low flood meant drought, and a flood that was too high meant widespread destruction, both of which naturally resulted in lower taxes. The river literally dictated the national budget. Which brings us to Section 4, Building Pyramids During Inundation. Timing the ancient megaprojects. We are now going to explore the final monumental ripple effect of the Nile and how the water physically allowed for the pyramids to be built in the first place. So the crucial point is how the river completely controlled the calendar. In early November, as the waters receded, property lines were redrawn and irrigation facilities were repaired. Then came the busy planting and harvesting seasons. But then came the summer inundation. The Nile would overflow its banks and flood the land, making farming absolutely impossible for months. It's like a giant pause button was hit on agriculture. So what do you do with an entire population of peasant farmers who suddenly have zero land to farm? Well, you create a monumental workforce. During this flood period, the government actually supplied work for these farmers, and it's so important to understand the sheer brilliance of this economic system because it actually dismantles a massive modern myth. There is zero literary or physical evidence that the Great Pyramids were built by slave labor. None. This was a state-sponsored public works program perfectly timed with the river's flood cycle. This labor was paid, or it served as a form of community service to pay off debt. These farmers were the ones doing all the heavy lifting, erecting temples, obelisks, and yes, the Great Pyramids. Furthermore, this provided the peasantry with their only real chance at upward mobility, as skilled painters, carpenters, and engravers were highly compensated for their work. If you want to know how this incredibly urbanized workforce achieved such staggering feats, you just have to look at the tomb of Jehudi Nakht, a 12th dynasty nomarch. His tomb features a painting depicting exactly how massive stones were transported. It clearly shows 172 people dragging a colossus, a 6.8-meter high monument, using ropes and a slide. And the secret ingredient making it all possible? Someone is shown dumping a liquid directly in front of the slide to reduce friction on the sand. It is a brilliant, practical snapshot of human cooperation, resourcefulness, and again, the strategic use of water. Finally, Section 5, The Nile's Enduring Legacy, a society engineered by nature. As we wrap up this explainer, it's just incredible to reflect on how deeply intertwined this entire civilization was with its environment. Everything from the taxing of bread and the creation of the Shaduf to the temporary workforce that dragged the massive stones for the Great Sphinx was fundamentally tied to the rhythm of the river. The Nile engineered Egypt just as much as the Egyptians engineered the Nile, which leaves us with a fascinating question to ponder today. Are our modern societies as perfectly adapted to our environments as the ancient Egyptians were to the Nile? It really makes you think about how we interact with the natural world around us today, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining me to explore this incredible source material. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next explainer.